Near the borders of a large forest lived a poor woodcutter who had 2 children, a boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel. They lived together with their father's new wife, their stepmother. They had very little to live on, and when there was a dreadful famine in the land, the poor woodcutter could not find enough food to feed his family. One evening, after the children were gone to bed, the parents sat talking together over their situation. And the poor husband sighed and said to his wife,
"What will become of us? I cannot earn enough to support myself and you, much less the children. What are we going to do? We cannot just leave them to starve."
"I know what to do, husband,"
she replied.
"Early tomorrow morning we will take the children for a walk across the forest and leave them in the thickest part. They will never find their way home again, and then we shall only have to work for ourselves."
"No, wife,"
said the man.
"How could I have the heart to leave my children all alone in the woods, where the wild beasts would kill them?"
"Oh, you fool!"
replied the stepmother.
"If you refuse to do this, all 4 of us will die of hunger, so you may as well go and cut the wood for our coffins."
The poor woodcutter could not sleep for hours, but lay thinking in sorrow about his children. The 2 children, who also were too hungry to sleep, heard all that their stepmother had said to their father. Poor Gretel wept bitterly as she listened, and said to her brother,
"What is going to happen to us, Hansel?" "Shh, Gretel, don't be sad. I know what to do,"
he whispered. Then they silently lay in their beds until their parents were asleep. As soon as it was quiet, Hansel got up, put on his little coat, unlocked the door, and slipped out. The moon shone brightly, and the white pebbles which lay before the cottage door glistened like new silver money. Hansel stooped and picked up as many of the pebbles as he could stuff in his little pockets. He then went back to Gretel and said,
"Don't worry, Gretel. We're gonna be just fine."
Then he laid himself down again in bed and slept till the day broke. As soon as the sun was risen, the stepmother came and woke the 2 children and said,
"Get up, you lazy bones, and come into the forest with me to gather wood for the fire."
Then she gave them each a piece of bread and said,
"You best keep that to eat for your lunch, and don't argue about it, because that's all you'll be getting."
Gretel took the bread because Hansel's pockets were full of pebbles. Then the stepmother led them a long way into the forest. They had gone only a short distance when Hansel looked back at the house. He did this every few minutes. At this, his stepmother asked,
"Why do you keep looking back so much?"
"Oh, stepmother,"
said the boy.
"I can see my little white cat sitting on the roof of the house, and I'm sure he's crying out for me."
"Rubbish,"
she replied.
"That is not your cat. It is just the morning sun shining on the chimney."
Hansel had seen no cat, but he stayed behind every time to drop a little white pebble from his pocket onto the ground as they walked. As soon as they reached a thick part of the wood, their stepmother said,
"Come on, children, gather some wood. I'll make a fire. It's very cold here."
Then Hansel and Gretel gathered a large heap of brushwood, which soon blazed up into a bright fire. Their stepmother said to them,
"All right, sit down here, children, and rest, while I go and find your father, who's cutting wood in the forest. When we have finished our work, we'll come back and fetch you."
Hansel and Gretel seated themselves by the fire, and when noon arrived, they each ate the piece of bread which their stepmother had given them for their lunch. As long as they heard the strokes of the axe, they felt safe, because they believed that their father was working nearby. Sadly, it was not an axe they heard, only a branch which still hung on a withered tree and had been swinging up and down in the wind. At last, when they had been sitting there a long time, the children's eyes became heavy, and they fell fast asleep. When they awoke, it was dark, and little Gretel began to cry, saying,
"Oh no! How are we gonna get out of the woods?"
But Hansel comforted her.
"Don't worry,"
he said.
"Let's wait a while till the moon rises, and then we'll easily find our way home."
Very soon the full moon rose, and Hansel took his little sister by the hand. The white pebble stones which Hansel had dropped as he walked that morning glittered like new money in the moonlight, pointing the way home. They walked all night long and did not reach their father's house till dawn. They knocked at the door, and when their stepmother opened it, she exclaimed,
"You naughty children! Why did you stay in the forest for so long? We thought you were never coming back."
But their father was overjoyed to see them, for it grieved him to think that they had been left alone in the wood. Not long after this, there came another difficult time for the workers. The children heard their stepmother talking again after they were in bed.
"Oh, the times are as bad as ever,"
she said.
"We have just half a loaf of bread left. The children must go away. We will take them deeper into the forest this time, but they will not be able to find their way home as they did before. It's the only plan to save ourselves from the starvation."
But the husband felt stressed. He thought it was better to share the last crumb of bread with his children than to try to get rid of them in the forest. His wife would not listen to anything he said, but continued to nag him, and just as he had given in to her the first time, he could not refuse to do so now. The children were awake and heard all the conversations. So as soon as their parents slept, Hansel got up, planning to go out and gather more of the bright pebbles to drop as he walked, so that they would point out the way home. But his stepmother had locked the door and hidden the key, and he could not leave. When he went back to his bed, he told his little sister not to worry, but to go to sleep in peace, because he was sure they would be taken care of. Early the next morning, the stepmother pulled the children out of bed, and when they were dressed, gave them each a piece of bread for their lunch, smaller than they had had before, and they started on their way to the wood. As they walked, Hansel, who had the bread in his pocket, broke off little crumbs and stopped every now and then to drop one, turning round as if he was looking back at his home.
"Hansel,"
said the woman,
"stop dawdling. Come along right now."
"Yes, stepmother. I just saw a pigeon sitting on the roof, and I wanted to say goodbye to him,"
replied the boy.
"Nonsense,"
she said.
"That is not a pigeon. It's only the morning sun shining on the chimney top."
Hansel didn't look back any more. He quietly dropped pieces of bread behind him as they continued walking through the wood. This time they went on till they reached the thickest and densest part of the forest, where they had never been before in all their lives. Again they gathered sticks and brushwood so their stepmother could make a fire. Then she said,
"Stay here, children, and rest while I go to help your father, who's cutting wood in the forest. When you feel tired, you can lie down and sleep for a while, and we will fetch you in the evening when your father has finished his work."
So the children remained alone till midday, and then Gretel shared her piece of bread with Hansel, because he had scattered his own all along the road as they walked. After this they slept for a while, and the evening drew on, but no one came to fetch the poor children. When they awoke, it was quite dark, and poor little Gretel was afraid. Hansel hugged her and told her that they just need to wait till the moon rose.
"Little sister,"
he said,
"you know that I have dropped little pieces of bread along our walk into the forest this morning. All we need to do is wait for the moon to rise, and we will be able to see where the pieces of bread are and follow it all the way back home."
When the moon finally rose, Hansel and Gretel went out of the thicket and looked around. they couldn't see any pieces of bread, not even a crumb. The many birds who lived in the forest had eaten their way home, every last crumb. Hansel tried to hide his fear when he made this sad discovery and said to his sister,
"Cheer up, Gretel. We'll find our way home without the crumbs. Let's give it a try."
But this they found impossible. They wandered about all night and the next day from morning till evening, but they could not get out of the woods. They were so hungry that had it not been for a few berries they had picked, they may have starved. At last they were so tired that their poor little legs could carry them no further. So they lay down under a large tree and went to sleep. When they awoke, it was the 3rd morning since they had left their father's house, and they decided to try once more to find their way home. It was no use. They only went deeper into the woods, and knew that if no help came, they would starve. About noon, they saw a beautiful white bird sitting on the branch of a tree and singing so beautifully that they stood very still and listened. When he had finished his song, he spread out his wings and flew on before them. The children followed him till at last they saw at a distance a small house. The bird perched on the roof. As Hansel and Gretel came nearer, they saw that the house was built of gingerbread and decorated with sweet cakes and tarts. The window was made of sugar and chocolate.
"Whoa!"
exclaimed Hansel.
"Let's stop here and have something to eat. I'm gonna have a piece of the roof first. Try some sugar window, Gretel."
Hansel reached up on tiptoe, and breaking off a piece of the gingerbread, he began to eat hungrily, swallowing mouthful upon mouthful. Gretel sat on the doorstep and began munching away at the cakes and doughnuts of which it was made. Suddenly a voice came out of the cottage.
"Munching, crunching, munching. Who's eating my house?"
The children were so busy eating, they didn't hear a thing, and went on eating. Hansel, who found that the cake on the roof tasted very good, broke off another large piece, and Gretel had just taken out a whole pane of sugar from the window, and seated herself to devour it. Suddenly the door opened, and a strange-looking old woman came out, leaning on a stick. Hansel and Gretel were so frightened that they dropped what they had in their hands. The old woman shook her head at them and said,
"Oh, you dear children, who has brought you here? Come in and stay with me for a while. You'll be safe, I promise."
She took them both by the hands as she spoke, and led them into the house. She gave them lots to eat and drink, milk and pancakes and sugar, apples and nuts, and when evening came, Hansel and Gretel were shown into 2 beautiful little bedrooms with white curtains. They lay down on the beds and thought they would never be happier. Unfortunately, the old woman who was pretending to be friendly was a wicked witch who had built her house of gingerbread on purpose to trap children. When lost children came to the house and let their greed take over, she would feed them well till they got fat and then cook them for her dinner. The witch, however, had weak eyes and could not see very well, but she had a very good sense of smell and would easily know when human children were near. As Hansel and Gretel had approached her cottage, she laughed to herself maliciously and said with a sneer,
"I have them now. They will not escape from me."
Early in the morning, before the children were awake, she was up, standing by their beds, and when she saw how beautiful they looked in their sleep with their round, rosy cheeks, she muttered to herself,
"What nice tidbits they will be."
Then she grabbed Hansel with her rough hand, dragged him out of bed, and led him to a little cage which had a lattice door, and locked him in. After this, she went back to get Gretel, and shaking her roughly till she woke, cried,
"Get up, you lazy brat, and get some water, that I may boil something good for your brother who is locked up in a cage outside till he gets fat, and then I shall cook him and eat him."
When Gretel heard this, she began to cry. But it was all useless. She had to do as the wicked witch had told her. For poor Hansel's breakfast, the best of everything was cooked, but Gretel had nothing for herself but a crab's claw. Every morning the old woman would go out to the little cage and say,
"Hansel, stick out your finger that I may feel that you are fat enough for eating."
But Hansel, who knew how bad her old eyes were, always stuck out a bone through the bars of his cage, which she thought was his finger, because she couldn't see well. When she felt how thin it was, she wondered very much why he did not get fat. However, as the weeks went on, and Hansel seemed not to get any fatter, she became impatient and said she could not wait any longer.
"Go, Gretel,"
she cried to the girl.
"be quick and get some water. Hansel may be fat or thin, I don't care. Tomorrow morning is it for him."
Oh, how the poor little sister grieved when she was forced to draw the water, and as the tears rolled down her cheeks, she exclaimed,
It would have been better to be eaten by wild beasts, or to have been starved to death in the woods.
"Stop your crying,"
cried the old woman.
"it is not of the least use. No one will come to help you."
Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out and fill the great pot with water, and hung it over the fire to boil. As soon as this was done, the old woman said,
"We will bake some bread first. I have made the oven hot, and the dough is already kneaded."
Then she dragged poor little Gretel up to the oven door, under which the flames were burning fiercely, and said,
"Creep in there and see if it is hot enough to bake the bread."
But if Gretel had obeyed her, she would have shut the poor child in and baked her for dinner instead of boiling Hansel. Gretel, however, guessed what she would do, and said,
I don't know how to get in through that narrow door."
"Silly goose,"
said the old woman.
"why, the oven door is quite large enough for me. Just look, I could get myself in."
As she spoke, she stepped forward and pretended to put her head in the oven. A sudden thought gave Gretel unusual strength. She stepped forward, gave the old woman a push, which sent her right into the oven. Then she shut the iron door and fastened the bolt. Gretel ran away to help Hansel. She opened the door of his cage and cried,
Hansel! Hansel, we are free! The old witch is dead!
He flew like a bird out of his cage at these words as soon as the door was opened, and the children were so overjoyed that they ran and cried with joy, hugging each other tightly. Now that there was nothing to be afraid of, they went back into the house, and while looking round the old witch's room, they saw an old oak chest, which they opened. In it they found pearls and precious stones.
These are way better than pebbles,
said Hansel, and he filled his pockets as full as they would hold.
I'll carry some too,
said Gretel, and she held out her apron, which held quite as much as Hansel's pockets.
Let's get out of here,
he said.
I've seen enough of this enchanted forest.
They had been walking for nearly 2 hours when they came to a large lake of water.
What are we going to do now?
Said the boy.
We can't get across. There isn't even a bridge.
Oh, here comes a boat,
cried Gretel. But she was wrong. It was only a white duck, which came swimming towards the children.
Maybe she will help us cross if we ask her,
said the child, and she called out,
Little duck, do help poor us. There is no bridge or a boat. Will you let us sail across on your feathery back?
The good-natured duck came near the bank as Gretel spoke. so close indeed that Hansel could seat himself and wanted to take his little sister on his lap. But she said,
"No, we'll be too heavy for her. I think it would be better if she carried us one at a time."
The good creature did as the children wished. She carried Gretel over first, and then came back for Hansel. Soon the children found themselves in a part of the wood which they remembered quite well, and as they walked on, the more familiar it became, till at last they caught sight of their father's house. They began to run, and bursting into the room, threw themselves into their father's arms. Poor man, he had not had a moment's peace since the children had been left alone in the forest. He was full of joy at finding them safe and well. They would never have to be afraid again, because, having no luck with finding any work nor food, the stepmother had run away, leaving Hansel and Gretel's father alone in the cabin. Gretel opened and shook her little apron, dropping the glittering pearls and precious stones all about the room. Her father gasped in surprise and knelt down to take a closer look, asking where she had found the precious jewels. Hansel and Gretel told their father the story of the wicked witch and how they had found the jewels and ran away to find him again. The man grabbed his son and daughter and cried bitterly as he held on to them tightly.
I should have tried harder. Maybe I could have searched the forest and found the jewels and afforded to provide a better life for us all.
Gretel wiped her father's tears.
"Don't worry, Father. We are no worse for it. It doesn't matter how our burdens have been lifted. All that matters is that they are."
With that, the two children started arranging the kitchen, making a fire, and fetching water to boil. The father watched how his once young, weak children had confidently went about their business. He grabbed his bow and arrow, determined to find something to add to the stewing pot. If his children could make the best of their dire situation, he surely could too.